Alrighty, this week we're going to be going over Psalm 114, and I'm really excited, so let's go and get started. Verse 1, When Israel came out of Egypt, Jacob from a people of a foreign tongue, Judah became God's sanctuary, Israel his dominion. The sea looked and fled, the Jordan turned back. The mountains leaped like rams, the hills like lambs. Verse 5, Why was it, sea, that you fled? Why, Jordan, did you turn back? Why, mountains, did you leap like rams, you hills like lambs? Tremble, earth, at the presence of the Lord, at the presence of the God of Jacob. And the last verse, who turned the rock into a pool, the hard rock into springs of water. If you've been with us for the past few weeks, I think that there's starting to be something. There's a trend here. I believe the last few weeks that we've been studying, the Psalms have continually gone back to the Old Testament. Obviously, it's in the Old Testament, but going further back, going back to Genesis, going back to Exodus, going back to the Exodus in particular. Right off the bat, when Israel came out of Egypt, it's a reference to the Exodus, and the second part of that verse is another way of saying the same exact thing. Jacob, or Israel, right? The tribes of Jacob, the tribes of Israel. His name was changed from a people of a foreign tongue, which is Egypt. And he's saying when that happened, verse 2 happened. That Judah became God's sanctuary, and Israel his dominion. If you think about this, that Judah became God's sanctuary, I started thinking, hey, what does that mean? What's the reference? And there's a couple ways of taking it. You see, this word sanctuary, it might remind us of the temple, where God's presence resides. It's his sanctuary. Or it might actually also be talking about how the tribe of Judah became the sanctuary for God, for God's seed. And that's a reference all the way back to Genesis 3, that through the seed of the woman, that God would crush the head of the serpent. And so it's through Judah that became the sanctuary. It kept the seed, the bloodline, if you will, protected. It also became the sanctuary. But no doubt that all of Israel still belongs to God, that he watches over them. And we see that exemplified in verses 3 and 4. It says, the sea looked and fled. Real quick question, and something you got to ask is, which sea? Which sea looked and fled? Well, can you think of any stories from the Old Testament? Maybe of any colors, seas? The Red Sea, right, perfect. The Red Sea looked and fled. Right, they come to the sea and they're trapped by Pharaoh's army. Some people are saying, hey, we want to go home. And what happens? The sea flees before them. It gets pushed back, and they walk through on dry land, right, and over to safety. The Jordan turned back. Do we know this reference? It's in Joshua, after they've been wandering for 40 years. They're ready to enter into the promised land, and as they do so, God holds back the waters of the Jordan, and all of Israel, the whole nation, passes through on dry land again. One of my favorite stories comes from this, where they get to the other side, and God says, in fact, in order one man from each tribe to grab a stone, grab a rock from the bottom of the Jordan, and when you've reached the other side and everyone has crossed over, assemble those together and create an altar. That idea, it's the idea of creating an Ebenezer, something that will remind, he says, so that when your kids grow up, they would walk by, they would see and remember what the Lord has done. The mountains leaped like rams, the hills like lambs. That might sound a little foreign to us. We don't really have an idea of what that means, except for the order that it comes in. The Red Sea, the Jordan, and then when we get here, the mountains leaped like rams, the hills like the lambs. This is really talking about the conquest of the land. Once they've come in, that the people, quote unquote, their hearts melted before the people of Israel because they had heard what the Lord has done. And so the people of the hills, they leaped like lambs. They were gone. They scattered. Same thing here. The hills like lambs. They scattered. They were gone. God provided the land for his people. As we come into verse 5, it's a reiteration of verses 3 and 4, but it's in question form. Why was it sea that you fled? Why, Jordan, did you turn back? Why, mountains, did you leap like rams? You hills like lambs. See, and I think our expectation of, we know the answer. We know the church answer. Why did they do all these things? Well, because of God. But the psalmist is writing this, and we started off, when Israel came out of Egypt, Jacob from a people of a foreign tongue, right? He says all these things. He says, when the people came, these things happened. When the people came, the sea looked and fled. They saw the people and they fled. When the people came, the Jordan turned back. When the people came, the mountains leaped like rams and the hills like lambs. And they're saying, why? Why did you do that? Is it because of the people? Verse 7 states it very clearly for us. And maybe not so clearly, but this is what it's saying. It's saying the Sunday school answer in a way that's different from us. Oh God, Jesus. It says, tremble, earth, at the presence of the Lord. At the presence of God, of the God of Jacob. Before we finish off those verses, taking this verse alone and tying it in with these two verses. Do we know our Bible stories? Because as the people went about, they were guided by day by a pillar of smoke or by a cloud, and at night by a cloud of fire or a pillar of fire, is what the Old Testament says. The very presence of God, the very presence of the Lord, the presence of the God of Jacob, leading the people. Isn't that why the sea fled, why the Jordan turned back, why the hills and the mountains fled like rams and lambs? I believe so. But see, the focus isn't on the people. The focus is on the Lord, not on his presence. And then verse 8 comes right after this. Tremble, earth, at the presence of the Lord, at the presence of the God of Jacob, who turned the rock into a pool, the hard rock into springs of water. The one who provided. Even when they didn't feel like following him anymore, when they said, hey, let's go back to Egypt, he provided for them through the rock by turning it into spring water. And I feel like so many times we can read through this and it becomes very mundane for us. But there's so much richness to this. So much so that we don't really get. I think we don't get it very, very much. Do we know the Old Testament stories? Because to understand the fullness of the psalm, we have to understand these Old Testament stories. And I just want to be the first to confess, like, I feel like I have to go through and reread. Reread what, Josiah? I'm literally mean the whole Old Testament. And let me point this out for us. Why this should bring life to our groups. I mean, you think about our Bible, the Bible that we have 66 books. Old Testament, the New Testament. And then what we have spends much of its time pointing back at the Old Testament. And even much of the Old Testament spends its time pointing back to these first 5 books. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers. Yeah, Deuteronomy, and even Joshua, Judges. I mean, really, you take those first 7 books, and a lot of the Old Testament, and especially the New Testament, spends its time pointing back at that. While those 7 books spends its time pointing forward. But before I get too far with that, let me walk us through this. Why do I say we need to know more? Why is there so much richness? Because these 8 verses can take us through those first 7 books of the Bible. In the reference with Jacob, we can go to Genesis 27 and really read through the end of the chapter, or sorry, the end of the book, Genesis 50. Now, it'll take some time and dedication from you guys. But if we want to know more fully, hey, how does Jacob tie into this? What are the promises given to Jacob? What are the covenants that God gave to Jacob? And why is it the God of Jacob? I would give that to you, but then I'd just be spoon feeding you. I want you to dive into this. I want you to really sell out and commit to reading God's word, taking it in, knowing these stories and knowing them well. It will only help to enrich your time with your small group. Oh, Egypt. How'd they get there? I think that's a question. Exodus opens up and it says they are already in Egypt. But for us to know that, we need to also know the life of Joseph, how they ended up in Egypt. And that story is in Genesis 37, all the way through the end of the chapter. Even in Joseph is mentioned in Exodus chapter 1. There was a famine. We need to know that. That was part of the reason why they came down to Egypt. Egypt is referenced really at the end of Genesis when Joseph is brought down. But the Israelites as a nation in Egypt comes up in Exodus chapter 1. Then we have them in slavery for a while. Moses is born. And then in here, we have the 10 plagues, the Passover happens, and then the Exodus. And just going straight through here, the sea, the Red Sea is a story that we should know. It's in those first few books. The Jordan is right here, Joshua. There's also the time of wandering that really adds a richness to into the entering of the promised land. Why didn't they enter right away? If you want to know that's those stories, Deuteronomy chapter 1, the whole book you can read through it. We get introduced to Joshua really in Deuteronomy. He's one of the spies. Then we hit Joshua 1. And with Joshua comes the conquering of the land. That would happen somewhere in there, where the mountains leap like rams and the hills like lambs, and all that because in Joshua is just filled with stories about what God did for His people in order to conquer the land before them, and they were to come in and take hold of the land. So all that. Tremble, earth, at the presence of the Lord. And all of it pointing back to Jesus. All of it really pointing back to who God is. When I first read through this, I thought this was interesting. Judah became God's sanctuary. That's at this time, the Psalms are being written, and that's happening during this time. If this really is written by David, it's written during a time of the United Kingdom. And so it's interesting that you could take this 2 ways. You could take it as Judah being a tribe within Israel, and Israel being the whole part. But then also there's later, after Solomon, the kingdom is divided. And it's interesting to think that the 2 kingdoms is Judah and Israel. But at the time this is written, the kingdom is still united. Unless somebody was planning on dividing the kingdom. It wouldn't make sense to understand this as Judah as the place of God's sanctuary, and Israel just, the northern and southern kingdoms. So, but this is what I really want to point us at. And why do I push? Hey, we need to know these stories. There's so much richness just in these verses. Because as what we know, the New Testament, all the way over there's all the prophets, all the way through the exile, First and Kings, all that. The New Testament spends a lot of its time going back to these times and the times before it. Even David in this psalm which be right around here, he takes the time to point back to the beginning, to point to all these things. And interesting enough, all of these, every single one, points forward. Okay, I'm going to stop there. Every one of these things points forward to what? Points forward to the cross, to the Messiah, to Jesus. Every single one of these things. Why do I bring that up? Well, because for us, if we know these stories, then all these things push us to the cross. And it's the cross, really, that pushes us forward in life. It's the cross that gives us hope, that gives us joy, that gives us the promise of a better world, a better life, a life that is fully consumed by who God is. You know, my hope and prayer for you, all of you, for your groups, is that the Psalms, as we go through the Psalms, that it would cause us to hunger and thirst to know God more. And how do we get to know people more? Well, we get to know their stories. And fortunately for us, we have so many stories about God. His people are in these stories, but as this psalm points out, it's really all about God. And how, yes, how God works in and through his people, but also for and on behalf of his people, so that they would have hope, so that they would enter into his promised land, into his presence. So, my challenge to all of you as core group leaders, you don't have to read all these, because then you would be reading all 7 books by Wednesday, but perhaps take a look back at the Red Sea, the story of the Red Sea. Take a look back at them crossing the Jordan. Take a look back at some of the stories in Joshua about them going into the land and conquering it. And take that, instead of seeing people, ask yourself, what is God trying to tell us about himself? So, alrighty. Hope this helps you out, and look forward to seeing you all on Wednesday. See ya.